Millfield was the kind of town that boasted charm in its cobblestone streets, in the vintage lampposts that flickered to life every evening, and in the familiar nods neighbors exchanged as they went about their slow routines. To anyone passing through, it looked idyllic, a town untouched by the chaos of the modern world. But appearances could be deceiving, and for Ethan Cole, the calm of Millfield was about to shatter with a single, careless mistake. Ethan was in his late 20s, with a lean, wiry frame and hands calloused from years of working in his father's auto shop. His brown eyes carried a restless energy, a constant flicker of impatience and irritation that often got him into trouble. That evening, the shop smelled of oil, rubber, and the faint metallic tang of a car battery left charging. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag, staring at the car in front of him, a black SUV, polished to perfection, that belonged to Jason Miller, his coworker. Jason was everything Ethan wasn't: calm, methodical, and obsessively careful. While Ethan thrived on improvisation, Jason meticulously double-checked every detail. That night, Jason had dropped off the SUV for a minor repair, an oil leak that he insisted must be fixed perfectly. Ethan had promised it would be done by the next morning. But when he leaned over the engine, tools in hand, impatience crept in. A flick of the wrench, a miscalculated push, and the SUV jolted violently. Ethan froze. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the empty shop. He stepped back and saw it, a deep, jagged scratch along the side of Jason's vehicle. His heart pounded. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a disaster. He cursed under his breath, pacing. He knew Jason's reaction wouldn't be mild. The SUV wasn't just a car. It was Jason's pride, something he cherished like a trophy. He could already imagine the look on Jason's face, the tight jaw, the cold stare. Panic surged through him. "I can fix it before he notices," Ethan muttered to himself, though he knew the scratch was too deep. He'll never know. But he did know, deep down, that lying wouldn't solve anything. Still, the fear of confrontation outweighed reason. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. The town was silent, streets empty. Ethan made a split-second decision. He would hide the car temporarily, figure out a miraculous fix in the morning, and pray Jason never found out. Hours passed as he maneuvered the SUV to a secluded corner behind the shop. Each creak of the tires against gravel made him flinch. Every shadow seemed to grow longer, twisting into the shapes of watching eyes. He laughed nervously at his own paranoia, but deep down, the unease didn't fade. The next morning, Jason arrived at the shop, his sharp eyes scanning the room as though they could see through steel walls. Ethan forced a casual smile, pretending to work on another car, hoping Jason wouldn't notice the empty space where the SUV usually sat. "Where's my car, Ethan?" Jason asked casually, though the edge in his voice made Ethan's stomach twist. I moved it to the back for some adjustments," Ethan stammered. His voice sounded too high-pitched even to himself. Jason's eyebrows arched skeptically. "You moved it?" Jason stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "I left it here last night. Why would you move it without telling me?" Ethan swallowed hard. I thought it would be easier to work on it. More space, you know?" Jason's gaze lingered on Ethan, sharp and assessing, and for a moment Ethan felt like a child caught in a lie. He could almost see Jason's mind ticking, trying to unravel what had happened. "Sure everything's fine?" Jason asked, though his tone wasn't entirely friendly. Ethan nodded, forcing confidence he didn't feel. But Millfield had a way of noticing things even before the obvious. Rumors began trickling through the small town as neighbors spotted Ethan acting strangely. He was jumpy at the diner, tense at the hardware store, and avoided eye contact with anyone he knew. By the afternoon, whispers reached the ears of people who didn't even know him well. "Did you hear what Ethan's up to? Something's not right." The innocence of Millfield was starting to crumble. That evening, Jason returned to the shop. His face was calm, but his eyes were stormy, betraying the anger he kept hidden beneath his composed exterior. "Ethan, let's talk," he said, stepping into the dim light of the garage. Ethan's stomach tightened. He had spent the entire day trying to plan a story, rehearsing what he would say, hoping to smooth things over. But Jason didn't give him the chance. He slammed the SUV's door and pointed to the deep scratch along the side. "It wasn't like this yesterday, was it?" Jason's voice was quiet, almost measured, but every word cut into Ethan like a blade. I don't know how that happened," Ethan said, panic rising. "I swear, Don't lie to me, Ethan. Tell me what really happened." Ethan's mind raced. One mistake, one tiny error in judgment had led him here. He could either tell the truth and face the consequences, or continue lying, risking far worse. Fear clouded his judgment, and his impulse for self-preservation overrode reason. It was an accident. I didn't mean to." Jason's eyes flashed with suspicion, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of the chain reaction he had started. The quiet town, the sleepy streets, and the unsuspecting neighbors, none of them could have imagined what one small mistake in the hands of a reckless young man could lead to. As the night fell over the quiet streets, Ethan's fear grew. He knew, without knowing exactly how, that this was only the beginning. A single argument, a single mistake, and the town's peaceful facade was about to crack in ways no one could predict. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The memory of Jason's sharp eyes and a deep gouge along the SUV's side haunted him. Every creak of the old mill-filled houses, every whistle of the wind through the streets seemed amplified in the silence of his small apartment above the shop. He had thought hiding the scratch would solve everything, but instead it had only made the problem worse. Every passing car, every shadow at his window felt like someone had discovered his secret. Morning came gray and heavy. The clouds hung low over the town, reflecting the weight pressing down on Ethan. He tried to focus on work. There were cars to repair, engines to check, but his hands trembled, tools slipping from his fingers more than once. His coworkers noticed. "You okay, Ethan?" one asked, but he waved them off, muttering something about a bad night. The lie tasted bitter in his mouth. By noon, the tension had become unbearable. Jason arrived at the shop again, this time not casually, but with a deliberate intensity that made Ethan's stomach tighten. He tried to hide behind a stack of tires, pretending to be busy, but Jason's eyes found him immediately. "Ethan," Jason said, calm yet unmistakably dangerous, "we need to talk. Now." Ethan swallowed hard. Look, Jason, I didn't mean for any of this." Jason cut him off with a steady glare. "Spare me the excuses. That car, that scratch, isn't something I can just overlook." The words hit Ethan like a punch. Panic bubbled under his skin. He had hoped Jason would let it slide, that perhaps the old familiarity and camaraderie would shield him from the consequences. But now Jason's calm menace made it clear there was no escaping this. "You'll have to make it right, pay for the repairs, or I take it further." Ethan's throat went dry. "Further? What do you mean?" His voice wavered. Jason stepped closer, voice low. "I mean, if this isn't fixed, I make sure everyone knows you lied. Everyone." It wasn't just about pride anymore. Jason's threat carried weight. It could ruin Ethan. Panic clouded his judgment, and in that single critical moment, Ethan made a choice he would regret forever. I can't do it," he stammered, backing up. "I don't have the money." Jason's face tightened, and for a brief instant, the calm disappeared, replaced with something darker, sharper. "You'll figure something out," he said, his voice icy. "You always do, but don't think you can hide from this." Ethan felt trapped, his chest tightened, and a strange, desperate thought raced through his mind. If he could just make Jason leave, if he could just make him stop, maybe he could fix everything. And before he fully realized what he was doing, he lunged forward in a moment of panic. The shove was small, almost accidental, but Jason stumbled, hit the corner of a workbench, and fell to the floor with a sickening thud. His head struck the concrete. Silence followed, broken only by the shallow, ragged sound of breath. Ethan froze, staring in horror. Jason wasn't moving. The color drained from his face. "No, no, no," Ethan whispered. He knelt, shaking Jason, trying to wake him, but it was too late. The accident had turned fatal. Panic surged in a tidal wave. He had killed his friend, his coworker, someone he had shared jokes, long nights, and dreams with. Breathless and trembling, Ethan dragged Jason's body into the shadows behind the shop. He didn't know what he was doing, only that he had to hide it. Each movement was clumsy, frantic, driven by fear. He felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, the town, the shop, the quiet streets, all judging him silently. Hours later, when the adrenaline faded, Ethan sat in the back of the shop, hands bloodied and shaking, staring at the ground. Millfield seemed quieter than ever, as though the town itself held its breath. Outside, neighbors went about their lives, oblivious to the horror hidden behind the workshop walls. But Ethan knew that nothing would ever be normal again. One mistake had spiraled into murder, and there was no turning back. Meanwhile, Detective Clara Hayes arrived in Millfield. She was new to the town, sharp, methodical, and with instincts honed over years of investigating disappearances and violent crimes. She didn't know Ethan yet, didn't know the web of lies and fear he was weaving, but she would. Her first day in town brought her to the police station, where reports of a missing man, Jason Miller, had just come in. He hadn't returned home, hadn't answered calls, and no one had seen him since the night before. Clara's intuition told her something was off. Millfield was small, people knew each other, secrets were hard to keep. She began her investigation, quietly asking neighbors, checking cameras, and taking notes on subtle inconsistencies. Each discovery made her feel the tension in the town, the hidden fractures that could explode at any moment. Back at the shop, Ethan tried to act normal. He smiled at customers, joked with coworkers, but each interaction felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of spikes. Every glance, every word was calculated, yet the more he tried to appear calm, the more his guilt showed. Friends and neighbors began to notice him, his nervous twitch, the dark circles under his eyes, the way he avoided anyone's gaze too long. Rumors started to spread. "Did you hear about Jason? Haven't seen him since last night. I think something happened at the shop." Ethan's panic grew. He had thought hiding the body would solve the problem, but the town had a way of noticing things, small details that others overlooked. Millfield was watching, even if no one said anything aloud. By Friday evening, the pressure became unbearable. Clara's investigation was closing in. Small clues began to point toward the shop, tire tracks behind the building, faint traces of blood, and eyewitnesses who claimed to see Ethan acting strangely the night Jason disappeared. Each day, the noose tightened, and Ethan, once impulsive but confident, now found himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. Every sound outside his window, every passerby on the quiet streets seemed like a potential threat. He began to suspect everyone, even his closest friends. He knew one slip could expose him, but the fear of being caught made him reckless, driving him further into panic and irrational decisions. By Friday evening, the town felt different to him. Shadows were sharper, the wind harsher, the lampposts casting long, menacing streaks across the pavement. Millfield's calm had fractured. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. One moment of carelessness, one mistake, had led to murder, and the ripples of that night were just beginning to spread. Ethan sat in the back of the shop as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the garage floor. He whispered to himself, half praying, half cursing, "I didn't mean for this. I didn't mean for any of this." But deep down, he knew it wasn't about intention anymore. The damage was done, and Millfield, the town that prided itself on quiet streets and safe neighbors, would never forget. The days that followed Jason's disappearance were like walking through a storm with no shelter. Ethan Cole felt it in every fiber of his body, the constant weight of guilt pressing down, the suffocating knowledge that one moment of panic had destroyed lives. Millfield, normally a town of quiet routines, seemed to pulse with suspicion. Neighbors watched each other from behind curtains. Every passing glance felt accusing. Ethan couldn't escape the feeling that the walls themselves were closing in. Detective Clara Hayes had been relentless. Every day she pieced together the chain of events. She interviewed shop employees, neighbors, and friends of Jason. A meticulous woman in her early 40s, Clara noticed patterns that others overlooked. She saw the tension in Ethan's body, the nervous twitch when he was questioned, and the subtle inconsistencies in his statements. "You're worried about something," Clara said softly one afternoon, her sharp eyes fixed on Ethan over a cup of coffee at the local diner. "I'm worried about the shop," Ethan replied automatically, forcing a casual smile. "It's a mess right now, a lot of work to catch up on." Clara didn't miss a beat. "You're not worried about Jason." Ethan choked on his coffee, coughing, trying to regain composure. He hated the way Clara could see straight through him, could see the guilt he had tried so desperately to bury. He wanted to run, to disappear into the shadows where no one could find him, but he knew that would only make things worse. Meanwhile, rumors in Millfield had begun to take a darker tone. People whispered in hushed tones about Ethan, about Jason's sudden disappearance, about the strange noises around the shop at night. Friends avoided him, and even those closest to him, his younger brother, his longtime neighbor, began noticing his restless energy, his sleepless nights, the way he jumped at the sound of any footstep outside. Ethan's paranoia became almost unbearable. He started seeing threats where none existed. The mailman's friendly wave became suspicious. A dog barking in the distance sounded like an accusation. He even suspected his own reflection in the shop windows of mocking him. Every corner of Millfield seemed to remind him of that night, of the accident that had become murder. One evening, as Ethan closed the shop, he noticed a shadow moving near the back alley. Heart hammering, he froze. A figure stepped into the dim light, and for a terrifying moment, he thought it was Jason returning, alive and furious. But it was Clara, flashlight in hand, notebook tucked under her arm. "Evening, Ethan," she said calmly, her voice cutting through his panic like a blade. "Mind if I ask a few questions about the shop?" Ethan swallowed hard. Sure, come in." His hands were clammy, his thoughts racing. Clara's calm demeanor was more frightening than anger. It made him realize just how vulnerable he truly was. She circled the shop slowly, eyes scanning every corner, every tool, every surface. "Jason was here the other night, closing time. Do you remember what happened?" Ethan's mind scrambled. I don't... Nothing unusual." Clara stopped near the back, her gaze piercing. "The tire tracks. You left them there, didn't you?" Ethan's stomach dropped. How could she know? He tried to mask his panic, but the trembling in his hands betrayed him. Clara was meticulous, methodical. She would see through any lie, catch him in any inconsistency. The noose tightened. By this point, Ethan's mental state had begun to unravel completely. He stopped sleeping at night, haunted by dreams of Jason's face, pale and accusing. He started to imagine that the town itself was watching him, that every stranger on the street was there to expose his secret. In these nightmares, Millfield became a labyrinth of suspicion and judgment, and he was trapped at the center. Then came the first shock of the unraveling. While rummaging through Jason's belongings, something he hadn't planned, a desperate attempt to understand and control the situation, Ethan discovered evidence that others in Millfield might have motives against Jason. A series of old grudges, unpaid debts, and secret rivalries painted a picture far more complicated than he had imagined. Suddenly, the town was no longer just an audience to his panic, it was a minefield of hidden agendas. This revelation, however, didn't make Ethan feel safer. Instead, it drove him deeper into fear. He realized that even if he survived his own guilt, the town might turn on him anyway. He became increasingly erratic, showing up late at work, avoiding neighbors, sometimes speaking to himself in whispers as he tried to plan his next move. Clara, meanwhile, closed in. She pieced together the timeline of Jason's last known movements, connected dots that Ethan hadn't considered, and subtly tested him with questions designed to provoke a reaction. She was careful, patient, and unrelenting, a predator in human form, watching her prey flail helplessly. One night, Ethan decided to confront the growing tension head-on. He returned to the alley behind the shop, the site of his worst panic, and stared at the shadows as though Jason might rise from them. In his mind, he rehearsed what he would do if confronted, if Clara or anyone else found out. But reality was crueler than imagination. As he knelt to examine the ground, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching, deliberate, steady, inhumanely calm. Clara emerged from the darkness, flashlight catching the glint of sweat on Ethan's brow. She didn't need to speak, her eyes said enough. Ethan knew in that moment that the walls had closed in entirely. There was nowhere left to hide, nowhere to run. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but authoritative, "it's time to tell me the truth." He stammered, panic and desperation overwhelming him. He tried to manipulate, to plead, to explain it away, but every word fell flat under Clara's unflinching gaze. The truth of his actions, the murder he had committed in a moment of terror, hung between them like a storm cloud ready to break. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The quiet town of Millfield, with its sleeping streets and familiar houses, seemed to lean in, waiting for the inevitable. Every secret, every small lie, every careless mistake had led to this confrontation, and Ethan, the young man whose panic had caused a life to be lost, finally realized that there would be no escape from the consequences of his actions. He bolted. Panic fueled his limbs as he ran through the alley, heart hammering, the town itself seeming to stretch and twist around him. He knew that escape was impossible, but desperation blinded him to reason. The chase had begun, a deadly game of cat and mouse between a man driven by fear and a detective whose patience was as sharp as a scalpel. The part ended with Ethan disappearing into the maze of Millfield streets, shadows swallowing him, and Clara following relentlessly. The audience is left on the edge of their seats, wondering whether Ethan would escape or would the town finally claim its reckoning. Ethan ran through the narrow streets of Millfield like a man possessed, each step pounding against the cobblestones, each breath ragged with fear. The town that had once felt familiar now seemed twisted, alien, almost alive in its judgment. Shadows stretched across the buildings, and the wind whispered threats through the empty alleyways. He knew he couldn't escape. He was trapped not just by Detective Clara Hayes, who pursued him with relentless precision, but by the consequences of his own panic, his own recklessness. Clara followed silently but relentlessly, her flashlight sweeping the streets, eyes sharp for any sign of movement. She had anticipated his panic, had calculated the possible routes, and she moved with a quiet confidence that contrasted sharply with Ethan's frenzied desperation. Ethan ducked into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, the kind of building that had once been a lumber mill, now hollowed out and forgotten. He pressed his back against a rusted beam, listening. The echo of his own breathing sounded unnaturally loud, and for the first time he truly realized the enormity of what he had done. Jason Miller was gone, dead, and there was no undoing it. Meanwhile, Clara approached the warehouse, her steps careful, measured. She paused at the entrance, scanning the darkness with her flashlight. "Ethan Cole?" she called, her voice calm, authoritative, carrying a weight that made him flinch even in the shadows. "It's over. Come out." Ethan's mind raced, thoughts collided like thunder, the accident, the panic, the hidden body behind the shop, the town's whispers, the investigation closing in. His instincts screamed at him to run, to fight, to vanish into the night, but his body betrayed him. He was exhausted, both physically and mentally, the weight of guilt pressing down like an anvil on his chest. He stumbled into the open, hands raised slightly in surrender, eyes wide with terror. Clara's flashlight caught his face, illuminating the sweat and fear, the hollow look of a man who had been consumed by his own mistakes. "Ethan," she said again, gentler this time, "just tell me the truth, no more lies." Ethan's voice cracked as he whispered, "I didn't mean to. It was an accident. I didn't mean to kill him." Clara's eyes softened for a brief instant. She had seen countless criminals, desperate men and victims of their own poor choices, but the cold reality remained. Jason Miller was dead, and the man before her was responsible. She stepped closer, handcuffs ready, and the weight of inevitability settled on Ethan's shoulders. The arrest was quick and quiet. As Clara secured him, neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the commotion. Murmurs spread through the town, eyes wide with shock. Millfield's peaceful facade had been shattered. The quiet streets that had once been a source of comfort now felt haunted. The trial that followed was swift. The evidence was overwhelming. Tire tracks behind the shop, traces of blood, witnesses noting Ethan's nervous behavior, and forensic analysis linking him to Jason's death. Ethan pled guilty to involuntary manslaughter, his lawyer arguing that the death was accidental, the result of panic, but the damage to the town's psyche had already been done. Millfield changed in the aftermath. People spoke in hushed tones about what had happened, children whispered the story in schoolyards, and even longtime residents felt a subtle but persistent unease. The shop where the accident had occurred remained closed for months, a grim reminder of how one small mistake could ripple outward with devastating consequences. Ethan sat in his cell, staring at the gray walls, haunted by memories of that night. He replayed every decision, every moment of panic, every word spoken and unspoken. He realized that intention mattered little. What mattered was the outcome, and the outcome was fatal. He had destroyed a life, fractured a community, and stained a town that had once been safe and serene. Outside the prison walls, Detective Clara Hayes returned to the streets of Millfield, her own thoughts heavy. She had solved the case, but the town would never be the same. She watched as neighbors avoided each other, as trust dissolved in subtle ways, as small acts of kindness became cautious, measured. The peace Millfield had taken for granted had been lost, and for the first time, Clara understood just how fragile the veneer of a perfect town could be. Jason's family grieved openly, their sorrow a constant reminder to the town of the human cost of impulsive choices. At his funeral, Ethan's absence was glaring, the empty space of a man who had caused this tragedy but could not atone. The town mourned, not just for Jason, but for the innocence that had been stolen, the belief that Millfield was safe, that accidents could remain contained, that life followed predictable paths. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly tried to heal, but the memories lingered like a persistent shadow. Every familiar street, every corner of the shop, every whisper in the diner reminded the townspeople of the night one mistake had escalated into murder. No one spoke openly about the fear, the tension, the guilt that lingered in their hearts, but everyone felt it. Millfield would never forget. Ethan, meanwhile, reflected on the choices that had brought him here. In his cell, he realized that his panic, his refusal to face consequences, and his impulsive actions had set off a chain reaction that could never be undone. He wanted to hide a scratch on a car to avoid embarrassment, and instead he had destroyed a life, ruined himself, and left an indelible mark on an entire community. In the end, Millfield learned a hard lesson. One small mistake could spiral beyond control, touching every life in ways no one could predict. Trust was fragile, people were fallible, and beneath the calm streets and picturesque houses, the shadow of that night would linger forever, a silent witness to the consequences of fear, panic, and human error.